Hello and welcome to The Good Congress, a production of the Sunwater Institute. My name is Brad Fitch, and I'll be your host for this series of podcasts. It will be walking you through interviews with leading experts in Congress and democracy. The goal here is to identify what principles and paths there are to a good Congress, explore strategies and proposals for improving congressional operations and outcomes, and hopefully build greater trust in democratic institutions. Let's get started with today's topic and guest. Katie Harbath was literally there at the dawn of social media when it was being launched and introduced to democracies all over the world. She is now the technology CEO of a technology policy firm, Anchor Change. But for many years, she was like employee number one or two at Facebook back when Facebook was cool in the early 2000s. She is originally from Green Bay, Wisconsin, and is a West Wing fan, according to her Wikipedia page. But she, over the time of her tenure at Facebook, was a leading trainer of how to use the platform for elected officials all over the world. Katie, welcome to the Good Congress.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with a little bit of a history lesson here. You were very involved in social media, democracy, elections, and Facebook very early in the time when social media was just coming onto the scene. Talk a little bit about that time and what were the challenges that elected officials and citizens faced in working with social media and democracy.
Yeah, I like to say that when I graduated college in 2003, who would have known that I would have ended up working 10 years at a company that didn't exist yet? I think it's hard for people to imagine a time when we didn't have Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, but that's where we were in the early 2000s and the 2004 election, which was President Bush's reelection against Senator John Kerry. We forget that this was the time of MySpace. We called it e-campaigning, right? Was what the campaigns did. And being digital meant it was having a website was revolutionary, right? Online donations was still very new. People were still not even used to e-commerce really yet and putting their credit cards online. We didn't have the iPhone. We had Blackberries. We had flip phones, right? And so I think it's important for people to kind of go back to that time and sort of remember what that was when we think about then when elected officials and campaigns were starting to do this. It was really exciting because it was much easier to fundraise and to do small dollar fundraising in a way that people had never been able to do before. There was a real way to be able to talk directly to citizens and not necessarily have to try to just get a journalist to cover what it was that you wanted to talk about. You were really able to control the message a little bit more. And in those early days, you tended to get a lot of really good earned media if you were showing that you were doing stuff that was cool and digital and sort of tech forward. And so something as simple as a web video would really get, a lot of attention on CNN or, in the news and stuff like that. And I think people also started to get really addicted. And I think this is something that we really did not think enough about, but it was great that you could measure clicks. So now you could put something out there and you got instant feedback of how your message was resonating with people, which on one hand was fantastic. You didn't have to spend a ton of money on a poll or anything like that. But on the flip side of that, what that has led us to, and I'm sure we'll have this conversation over the last 25 years, I think is something that we've been chasing numbers and clicks and engagement. And that tends to cause people to be more emotional, perhaps would be the right word, in their posting and maybe more provocative in trying to get a reaction out of folks. But those early days were very much, it still feels like the Wild West, but it was hard to get people to even want to use these tools because they were like, what is this thing? This is guys in their basement. Why do I want to? Why do people care what I'm eating for lunch and stuff like that? So it was, I don't want to be like everybody was clamoring and banging down on my door. In fact, it was the opposite. I was banging on their door
Yeah, I
and
remember
trying to
that.
convince
Yeah.
them to do it.
I was cheering you on because at the time I was working at the Congressional Management Foundation and encouraging members of Congress to use new technologies and new platforms. And I'll give you an anecdote you'll like hearing about the instant reaction that politicians could get. I was about to go on C-SPAN in 2011 because CMF was producing the first report on social media in Congress. And I'm waiting in the waiting room watching another member of Congress talk about, I think, the debt ceiling or something on Washington Journal, and her press secretary was in the room with me, and she's got her iPhone out, and she's looking at her Twitter feed, and she's saying things like, "Oh, they like that line on Twitter. Oh, they don't like that." She was getting an instant reaction to the interview that was going on live. And I asked the press secretary, "Will the member of Congress see this?" And she said, "Oh yeah, she's going to grab this from my hand before she gets to the elevator. She loves this." And one of the things that we perhaps don't know in the public is that politicians are just craving feedback. I mean, they're political animals. One member of Congress said, she said to me, "I think all members of Congress are still middle children trying to please their father." And there is nothing more pleasing and gratifying than the instant gratification of social media. But as you point out, there's a flip side to it, that there is a darker side to it, and it does allow people to be anonymously provocative, would be a polite way of saying it, but it can be much darker than that, as you point out. You were there early on, and there were some early adopters in the Congress for social media, and you were guiding them through their early travels. What distinguished those members from their colleagues who were slower to adapt the new technologies?
Yeah. Representative Kingston comes to mind, was one of the first folks that really started putting together, I think started like some of the first blogs, was one of the first members to like bring people like me and Mindy Finn and Patrick Ravini and stuff in to actually do some of these trainings. And this is even before I was at Facebook. This is when I was still at the RNC. And doing some of that stuff. And I think what really set some of these folks apart was, they had staffers, like Kingston had David All and other folks like Matt Lira. So you had some folks that were in Congress, the staffers that were really interested in this and sort of early adopters and really pushing their bosses to it. But these were folks, members who were willing to try new things. They weren't scared of sort of failing at it. They were willing to be like, sure, let's try it and see what happens. I think too, there were folks that really liked the attention that they got for being a first mover as well, and liked and sort of had that personality of wanting to go and evangelize and be the one that sort of goes and tells them about this cool new tool. Like, have you heard about this thing called Twitter? Like, look at this stuff that I can do, and getting people on it. And so they just sort of have that entrepreneurial spirit, if you will, and sort of were one of those folks that naturally were okay with trying out new things and putting their messages out there and seeing what happened and then adapting from there.
But there has to be also a level of authenticity too to social media that makes it a little different than television. I mean, television, you can fake an 8-second soundbite. I mean, and I've done it and coached my bosses on how to do it. But I remember early on when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez got elected in, I believe it was 2018, and the Democrats had her train other Democrats on using social media, and I was like, that's like having Picasso train kindergartners finger painting. I mean, it just there does have to be some level of honesty and authenticity to social media, or it just doesn't break through.
And you need it to not be so controlling, right?
Yeah.
About what it looked like. Like there were so many times I had to tell people, don't just be posting pictures of you like shaking somebody's hand, right? You wanted more candid shots of what that was. You didn't want it to be just the 8-second soundbite. People wanted to hear. I mean, this is why I think now people love these long form podcasts. Like Gavin Newsom just co-hosted Pivot with Kara Swisher, like an hour long. People want to hear that. And to your point, they want to hear that authenticity. They sort of want to see these folks as humans, and they want to know more than just about what it is that you're doing in Congress. They do want to know, like, I think it was Speaker Boehner, like in his like turkey brine recipe, right? Or like mowing the lawn and different stuff like that. And so the offices that were willing to show that had people that were willing to show that authenticity and really willing to find that blend of sort of like, here's who I am as a total person versus this package that I've like this visage that I've tried to build for you of who you think I am, definitely did a lot better.
Katie, one of the interesting parts of your life, and must have been really fun, was you traveled to other countries and worked with other elected officials. What distinguished American politicians and the use of social media from elected officials in other nations?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it's important for people to know that I always tell folks the way the United States works with its elections and its politics is on like anywhere else in the world. It is the exception versus the rule. And so many times, usually it was things were happening in the United States first, and then it got exported out to other countries. And so where I really saw this happen was after Obama won in 2012. And if you remember, yes, in '08 it was considered the Facebook election and he used technology, but 2012 he turbocharged it. He turbocharged using data and digital tools and everything. And there was just a bajillion articles written after that election, just praising everything that the Obama team had done around all of this. And so and now at this point in time, I'm at Facebook, and now we are starting to have public policy folks being hired in places like India and Brazil and Europe, all those places, and they're now getting policymakers coming to them, being like, "I want to do what Obama did. How do I do that?" And those folks are experts in like privacy law and tax law, and they're coming to me and they're like, what do I tell them? Right. And so I pitched to Facebook that we should start building out this international team. We had already had somebody in Europe, but we didn't have anybody doing stuff elsewhere. And so in 2013, I started going to places like India, and a lot of it was somewhat starting kind of a little bit at basics again of like, this is a news feed. This is what the types of content that work really well on the platform. Here's how, I would have our advertising folks with us too, because I think that's another important thing for folks to know. I wasn't on the sales team. My job was not to sell ads. We had another team that did that. This was about using those organic tools, because the thought was, we clearly failed at this, but the thought was maybe when the time comes to regulate us, if they use the tools, they'll have a better understanding of how they work. I don't know. Some of them do, some of them don't, right? I guess it's a bit of a mixed bag around all of that. But so there was a little bit of starting at basics, but I also saw that there was also a willingness sometimes to, again, be a little bit more experimental in trying some of these different tools. Australia in particular, some of those campaigns, and many of that too, you have American consultants that tend to go to the Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, like other English-speaking areas to do consulting for those parties to kind of bring the American tactics to there. But then there was also really big differences. Like in Germany, Germans come over here to the States all the time wanting to know how to do campaigns. And the minute I start talking about data, and they're like, oh, no, can't do that. Can't do that. Can't do that based because of European data laws, right? And speech laws are just different. And so you have to help them adapt and kind of think about, okay, if you can't do it exactly the way we're doing it here in America, let's think through how we might be able to change that up. I think the other big thing too that's really different is that the US always feels like we're in a perpetual campaign cycle, right? Like, I mean, let's be honest, 2028's already started. Like, we're going to have midterms, but the 2028 presidential's already started. I've got countries right now that I'm working in where, like, for instance, France might do another snap election. They're going to do a no confidence vote, I think, around September 8th, which is a kind of a shock. They just had an election last year. And if they call a snap election, it'll be in 30 days. So it's not a lot of time for people to ramp up what it is that they're doing. The last thing I'll say that's very different about the United States versus elsewhere is most other countries have what are called blackout periods. And this is usually 24 to 48 hours, but in some countries like France, it can be like 3 months too, of not only what the candidates can do, and sometimes the candidates in that time period can't say or post or do any rallies or anything like that, but also like the media, they can't do polling, they can't share other things because it's meant to get so that there isn't some sort of surprise in the last 48 hours that people don't have time to react to.
As if we need another reason to move to the south of France. But anyway, we could avoid politics for 3 months. Are you kidding?
It's really, you look at Nick Clegg, who is the chief global affairs officer of Facebook, has a book coming out next week. Well, I don't know when this will air, but he has a book coming out. Forgive me on the timing. But one of the things is whenever Europeans come over to America, like our politics, they understand how it works, like the mechanics of it, but the underworkings and like sort of like this constant campaigning and thinking about the politics versus the policy of it all. I was explaining that to somebody the other day because they're like, well, go talk to these folks. I'm like, no, no. They're policy experts. They're not the political experts of how these issues will be framed and thought about. And that's something very hard, I think, for those outside of the United States to get their heads wrapped around because they don't talk about politics nonstop.
And they also don't have the advocacy infrastructure
Yeah.
overseas. I remember talking to people in Great Britain, and they were shocked when I would tell them, well, first of all, you have to appreciate that advocacy in the United States is a $12 billion industry. And they're like, what? They don't have trade associations and lobbying because when you're in a party line vote, it's really nothing to lobby about. And members of Congress have a lot more independence.
Well, and that's a big difference too, is these parliamentarian systems, you're voting for the party, not a person.
Yeah.
And so that also changes with social media. It's very personality centric. And so that's also sort of a challenge for these parties of like, how much do we push forward a particular person? The person that likely is the party leader, right, and would become prime minister or something like that. But it's really a much more collective type of thing versus an individual thing.
Let's move to the present. Right or wrong, social media has been tagged or blamed for some of the things that ails our democracy. First, is it fair, in your opinion, to tag all social media popular tools, Facebook, X, Instagram, with the same label, or are there some distinctions because of the way the platforms work that, no, this is a little bit more able or inclined to be a malevolent force in our democracy? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have many. I think that I think one is we tend to think mostly about like the big ones, right? Like Facebook, X, Google, because they tend to be in the news a lot, and they're ones that a lot of people use for sure. But we actually have quite a fragmented system now, right? Because we've got TikTok, Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads, Twitch. You've got all these podcasts. You got True Social, you got Parler, you got Gab, you got you know all of these different places that people can go, which on one hand, I think is really great because it helps with competition and gives you choices of where it is you want to go. But on the other hand, I think a lot of people are sort of like, is it causing filter bubbles and people to go into their different, tribes and stuff like that? And each of those platforms do work very differently. Blue Sky, for instance, and how they handle content moderation. I won't go into all of the details, but it is different than the other platforms in that it doesn't take very much down other than stuff that's illegal, but it labels it. And then people have more of a choice of how much moderation and what types of content they're wanting to have in their feed or not, depending upon what it is that they're okay with and what they want to see. That's different than maybe how a Facebook might work. And so I do a lot of work with a lot of these different platforms there, and there is actually quite a few differences in how they want to approach all of this. But I think the thing about when we look at what's ailing our democracy, social media and the internet has absolutely contributed to it, but it is not the sole cause. Like if we could pull the plug on the internet tomorrow, it is not going to magically change how we all operate, right? Like you see a lot of studies that people were sort of self-sorting by kind of party and political affiliation with where they were moving. I think start going as far back as the 60s and 70s,
Yeah.
if I remember right. Like you think about things like how conservative talk radio really built up in the 80s. Around all of that. And so I think and also the media itself and what that looked like. So I really hope that as we continue, like when people look back at this period, can we look at it sort of as a holistic type thing versus just being like, oh, if only Facebook had sometimes I feel like people are like, if Facebook had just made this one decision, this wouldn't have happened, and I don't even know what this is. Like we don't have a singular definition of success of what this is supposed to look like. And I think sometimes people are like, it means that a certain person won the election or not, but that's not really what democracy is in my mind. It's for me, do we have free and fair elections? Are people able to, have debate and stuff like that? Like those are indicators for me that are really important to this, not necessarily that a specific person did or did not win.
Let me move on to a little more specifics and actually almost a prescriptive bit of advice you might have for elected officials. When you see elected officials using social media well, what does that look like? And are there any examples of people you want to point to and say, oh, yeah, I was seeing this person on X or I saw this person on Facebook and I really was impressed by whatever they did? What does good social media
Yeah.
practices look like?
So Jen Felka, who is somebody who has a book called Rebooting America and was one of the first people to create the digital service in the White House and does a lot in the States, had a really great Substack piece earlier this month about good politicians. And she's like, I really would love to do stories. And she had one about a gentleman who I actually know. His name's Matt Mahan, I think it is. He's mayor of a town in California. And forgive me, I can't remember exactly which one, but she was talking about the fact that one of his constituents was complaining on Twitter about not about, I think it was about a bunch of paperwork or something like that they had filed, and the margins weren't exactly 1 inch. And so they got it rejected. And like the photo literally showed, they sent them a photo of the ruler and it was like an eighth of an inch off, right? And she tells the story about how Matt, as mayor, responded to her on Twitter, was like, let me look into this. This doesn't seem right. And then comes back to her the next day on Twitter and is like, hey, I talked to my team about this. And the reason they're so strict about this is because the county is so strict about it. So we were trying to save you time of it getting rejected at the county level. We do need to try to fix this. And we're trying to, and he's like, you don't have to redo the whole thing. You literally can just take a paper cutter and like just slice off a little bit more of that inch and you're going to be fine. And that was like, I thought that was a lovely example of sort of like using monitoring what's happening on social media and seeing what your constituents are saying, but sort of that mundane everyday stuff that most politicians
Wow.
need to deal with that people don't realize, and using social media to have that sort of not just engaging with them, but actually helping to explain what's happening and helping to them to solve problems is sort of like that was the dream when I first started doing all this and having politicians sort of doing that and actually engaging with their constituents.
And I would definitely want to echo that Jen Pelka is probably one of the best thinkers we have in America right now in looking at the fusion of technology and government. I interviewed her last year as part of a session with the Modernization Staff Association, and her book is amazing and her writing is wonderful. I want to end on a positive note, but a little different note. I know you wear another hat related to democracy. You are the chair of the board of the National Conference on Citizenship. Tell us a little bit about the NCOC and what the work it does to help our democracy.
Yeah, the National Conference on Citizenship was actually started after World War II. So it's been around for quite some time. It's one of the few, it was congressionally chartered back in 1953. So it was started in 1946, officially chartered in 53. And the goal, it was created by Congress to help. They were worried that people weren't going to be as civically engaged as the war ended and that people sort of moved on with their lives. And so they wanted this to be an organization of other organizations around the United States that were focused on citizenship. And it's our main goal is an annual conference. We have one coming up here in September, where we would bring all these different organizations together to learn from one another, to think about how it is that we can continue to improve citizenship in the United States. It's gone through many permeations over the years. And so lately, it's been very focused on data. So there is data that for the census that that they ask some certain questions around citizenship and things like voting, not just voting, but like volunteering in your neighborhood and things of that nature. And so we do this civic health index that we work with different states and communities in which to do. We had some projects around the census itself. We had something called Pandemic to Prosperity around looking at how people were coming out of the COVID pandemic and trying to rebuild their communities and their small businesses and stuff like that. But we're very much, it's a fantastic organization and one that continues to kind of grow and evolve. And we're really trying to think about, next year's America's 250th. We're trying to think about what that looks like and what citizenship can look like. And we're really trying to think about how can we help people kind of go back to local, right? Like I think that so much of the things we see in the news are all very federal, like at the federal level and the national level that we're we're focused on when the things that really impact us day to day are the ones that are happening in our city council meetings and our school board meetings. And so, how do you help to improve access to people about what those things are that are happening and how they can actually, improve their own communities and be involved there? So, that's some of the work we're working on.
Well, it's great work. I've been working on and off with the organization. I've been to your conferences in the past. They are fantastic, and I would encourage people to look at the Civic Index because it's a unique examination and assessment of volunteerism and citizen engagement in the United States.
And if I can, Brad, just because of the audience you have, I think one thing people need to know is that this data is under threat right now. What with the cuts that the Trump administration and others are doing, there's the chance that that the census won't be gathering this data anymore. A lot of it's also managed by AmeriCorps, that's also under a lot of cuts. And I totally understand, obviously, budget cuts, like we can't always keep everything, but I do think that as we continue to look at these things, we need to make sure that we're not cutting things where there's unintended consequences that come from it, because this data really does power a lot of different organizations in being able to make informed decisions about how people are wanting to engage in their communities versus us trying to guess.
Well, Katie Harbath, thank you again for being our guest on The Good Congress.
Thanks for having me.